They got word that trouble was coming.
The white folks are killing the colored.
Barbaric violence was committed against Black people across this country.
Kerosene was dropped from an airplane.
Why did nobody ever teach us this? Because they didn't want you to know.
When it was an opportunity to wipe out a community, they took it.
I cannot imagine that there are mass graves somewhere in our community and we didn't try to find them.
They're buried somewhere, and the question is where?
We have encountered human remains.
It was like they had found people who had been disappeared by history. The earth had unleashed the truth.
We view this as a murder investigation.
I'm gonna raise my voice.
Some people say that city officials orchestrated a cover-up. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a chapter in a book. It happened to real people.
They burned the whole town down. But it will rise again.
It's nice to make your acquaintance.
It's nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I really, first of all, Dawn Porter is, she's one of the great filmmakers and just a terrific person. And I watch everything she makes. And and when I was asking for her, I said, I'd like to talk to you too, if you're available, because, this is, you're navigating, you're your voice, and you're helping us navigate, you're navigating through the story. So you're terrific. And it's an important story. I've kind of, believe it or not, I've covered this. There've been a few different stories or films told about the Tulsa, tragedy. And so I think, and now that we're actually at the anniversary, shall we call it, I'm glad this one will be seen by lots of people on National Geographic Channel.
Yes, yeah.
Cindy, so we learned from the beginning, DeNeen, that you're a reporter, you're a journalist, you work for the Washington Post?
Yes.
Okay, and you were following the story. I should really let you tell it, but I kind of wanted to also let you know that I was very invested in this story, which is called Rise Again, Tulsa and the Red Summer. But you typically try to present stories about the African-American story, right? You're telling, that's yes. Kind of what you're doing. Stories that might be otherwise ignored, or, you're right, these are unquote. Okay, so, and then you were following this not long ago, the story of these, about this area in Tulsa where they were believed was a mass grave.
Yeah.
And that's where we start off. It's a very powerful beginning. But can you, what made you, I guess, what made you want to tell this particular story? Was it the encroaching anniversary, or were you already very, very tied to the story way before that, or what was the origin?
Okay, so I have been a writer at the Washington Post for more than 35 years. And about 6 years ago, my editor, Linda Robinson, launched a blog within the Washington Post. It's called Retropolis, like Metropolis, but with an R.
Okay.
But there's a team of reporters, writers, who yes. are assigned to essentially watch the news. And when something happens in the news, we dive back in history and research history on deadline, and then come back with a narrative. So that was my job for the last 6 years. So the way I got started working on the Tulsa race massacre story is in 2018. Actually, I came here to Tulsa to visit my dad, My father lives in Tulsa. I am from Oklahoma. I was born in Oklahoma. I have relatives all around here. My great-grandmother lived in Tulsa. My grandmother was born in Boley, which is an all-Black town about 60 miles from Tulsa. It's famous for its rodeo. So my people are from Oklahoma. So this story really starts with a visit to my dad. And I say to my dad, Daddy, let's go have lunch on Black Wall Street. And so we go to the Greenwood Cultural Center, which is a center that captures the history of this massacre. And we visit there, and then we go have lunch on Black Wall Street at a little soul food cafe called Wanda J's. And I look around and I notice that there's a minor league baseball stadium. There's a luxury apartment complex and a yoga studio. And I say to myself, my goodness, Black Wall Street, the site of one of the most horrible racial massacres in US history, is being gentrified. So I fly back to DC, talk to my editor, and I tell her about this trip. And she says, that's a great story. Washington Post editors send me back here. And that's when I start reporting on the ground in August of 2018. I come here, I'm talking to the Black activists who've been crying out for justice for this massacre for nearly 100 years. I interview Councilwoman Vanessa Hull Harper, her campaign manager, Christy Williams. They take me to different sites in Greenwood to explain the massacre. At one point, they make me get out of the car and I have to walk with my hands up down the street. You've seen the famous photos of the Black men marching at gunpoint to internment camps after the massacre. They made me walk with my hands up like this. And I say, there's a certain point when you feel the story, it hits you in your heart, in your core, and that's when I felt it. Because as you and your listeners may know, that after this massacre, in which more than 300 Black people were killed, those who survived the massacre and who were still in Greenwood on June 1st, 1921, were rounded up and marched to what they called internment camps. So I felt the story. They also, Christy Williams and Vanessa Harper took me to Oaklawn Cemetery, where they said that a commission in 1998 found, with ground penetrating radar, found anomalies beneath the ground that were consistent with mass graves, but the city closed that investigation and never dug. So what happens next? My story lands on the front page of the Washington Post in September 2018. There's a community meeting a day or two afterwards, and the current mayor, G.T. Bynum, is explaining that he has plans for development in North Tulsa. And that's when Pastor Reverend Turner, who's pastor of Vernon AME Church, he holds my story up. He told me he held my story up. And he said to the mayor, you wouldn't have this land to develop had there not been a massacre. What are you going to do about it? And that's when the mayor announces that he's going to reopen the search for mass graves. So the activists here say that that story, national story, was a catalyst for the mayor reopening the search for mass graves.
Thank you for recapping that trajectory. But what the film also a number of things, and one thing is the second part of the crime, or third or fourth part, is the quelling, the squelching of the story in the first. Okay, it's not unique. The erasing of this story, right, is part of the film story. I mean, or at least it's a byproduct of it. That's as big a crime to me, that it's not in the history books. It hasn't historically been taught in our history books. Okay, so there's that. And then also, it seems even very recently, before this current mayor, that the story was continuing when they closed that case. That's yet another example of how they keep trying to kind of erase this story. which does nobody a service. And I think anybody watches the movie, regardless of your creed, color, whatever, race, you're going to realize, or at least I hope so, that there's no benefit to erasing any part of our story. I think that's where we have to get to understanding. But I wanted to know, we'll come back to all that, but I wanted to know also, since you brought it up early on, since you grew up in Oklahoma, sounds like relatively close, your dad was in Tulsa. How much was this story told in your childhood and in your school and in your experience as a kid?
It wasn't really. I mean, you hear, my dad talks about studying geography in Oklahoma and Oklahoma history, and never learning about it. It wasn't in textbooks. There was a conspiracy of silence, a deliberate cover up by civic officials and city officials to make this story of this massacre go away in Tulsa. They called it a quote unquote embarrassment because they were trying to build Tulsa as an oil capital of the world. And they literally tried to erase the massacre from history. Wasn't in textbooks, wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't really, white people stopped talking about it even after they took photographs and postcards standing over the bodies of Black people. They eventually stopped talking about it. Black people would whisper about it only because, you know, there was concern that it might happen again. So even in families, it was just whispered about. So I was talking to my aunt yesterday about my great-grandmother who lived in Tulsa. And my aunt was saying that she would only hear bits and pieces of it when adults were like in the kitchen. You could hear bits and pieces of the conversation about the massacre. And so it really wasn't talked about with children. So my family, I'm still learning, literally learning about what my family knew, learning that, you know, what my family's connections are to Tulsa. I do know that during the massacre, many Black people fled Greenwood or the surrounding Black towns.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And that's where my grandmother was born, in Boley, Oklahoma. Growing up, I was just a really curious child, a student of history. I'm always trying to figure out, well, what was left out of the textbooks? This doesn't make sense, Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones. And Mrs. Jones was so irritated with me because I was asking questions about what was between the spaces in the textbook. Black people are just like kept to this one little paragraph. And I'm like, well, there's something missing, Mrs. Jones. And so I actually, as a child, started trying to read as much as I could about Black history outside of what I was being taught in school. And that's kind of where my curiosity is launched about these race massacres and Black history.
And probably, I'm going to guess, contributed to your career, deciding on a career, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it was always in the recesses of my mind. It was a buried story. When I became a journalist, I mean, it's just one of those questions that resides in the back of your mind. And so again, when I've been at the Washington Post for 35 years. Ben Bradley actually hired me.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal.
It is.
Ben Bradley, of course, published the Pentagon Papers right?
Yeah, he was the executive editor of the Washington Post during Watergate. Catherine Graham was the publisher.
She was there. Wow.
She was there at the Washington Post.
You look like a kid. I don't believe you.
Sorry. Believe me. So
you've already forgiven me for my tardiness, so I don't. But I'll keep complimenting.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So yeah, I graduate. I land in the Washington Post very, very young, and the legendary reporters and editors are still there. Bob Woodward is still there.
It's just amazing, yeah.
And that summer, at the end of the summer, Ben Bradley, I'm called into his office and he hires me. So Over the course of my career, I've covered police, education, courts, education. I've covered it all. Homicides. I was a foreign correspondent for the Post. I was the Canada bureau chief, where I wrote about climate change, and I did a lot of work in the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, writing about climate change. One of my first assignments up there was I traveled on a Coast Guard icebreaker through the Northwest Passage to document the thinning of the sea ice.
You're the one who should be doing a podcast. Why am I wasting my time here? Or everybody else's, I should say, because you have, it sounds like you're the one with the stories. You should be doing this podcast.
No, I'm happy to be interviewed. I'm just a writer and a storyteller, and I'm happy to be working on this project, Red Summer, Tulsa.
Well, I wonder if it's getting, if it doesn't ironically get more attention, the centennial, because of our last 5 years of post-racial life here in this country, right? We're post-racial, so, but I say that with ironically, but the last 4 or 5 years have shown us we're very much not the case. The fact, obviously, with Black Lives Matter and so many endless number of police shootings, etc., we know, well, that things are as heightened as they've ever been. And I wonder if it's always the case, like this case of the Tulsa Massacre. This was during Jim Crow, correct? So like one thing I think I learned late in life, again, maybe because of limitations of my own education, was that you'd think that the most dangerous time was during Reconstruction, perhaps. Like now slaves are now free people, and you would have thought that would have been a very, very dangerous period of time. But it seems like no, it was once they actually had rights, political, like legal rights, and started to gain some power in their own over themselves, and in the case of Tulsa, created their own economy that was hugely successful. That's why they called it Black Wall Street. And that became the threat. And I find like we're kind of back there again with the country in this Trump era, where all of a sudden we're a minority majority, and it's a big threat to whites. Is there a parallel here, or is it my imagination?
It's not your imagination.
I know.
There is a parallel. So immediately after the Civil War, while Lincoln was alive, he sent federal troops into the South to protect the newly freed Black people.
Okay.
So after his assassination, President Andrew Johnson removed those troops, and that's when it became more dangerous for Black people.
Okay. They also decided not to try and punish many of the Confederate military leadership. So or troops, in order to quell.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So after Johnson comes into office, he rescinds a lot of the measures that Lincoln had put in place to protect Black people. And also, you've heard of 40 acres and a mule. Those were reparations,
right?
The original reparations for formerly enslaved Black people. When Johnson comes into office, he takes away that protection. He also takes away that land. And so what happens what's happening during Reconstruction is there's a rise in economic power among formerly enslaved Black people, many of them, for example, coming to Oklahoma and establishing Black towns. There's an increase in the voting of Black men. You have Black men all over the country elected to local, state, and even federal offices. When Black men received the right to vote. Some people don't know there was a Republican Black senator from Mississippi elected to the U.S. Senate, and there were Black men elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And
well, Dawn Porter has a lot more documentaries to make, clearly.
So what happens with that rise in economic power and rise in voting power, there comes this backlash, boom, from white people. And that's when you start seeing the Jim Crow laws, the really fierce segregation laws. You see a second resurgence of the Klan trying to defeat Black people, really trying to exterminate their economic power and actually exterminate them. So you see this in Red Summer. Red Summer, I argue, begins in 1917 in East St. Louis when white mobs angry about Black men taking jobs began pulling Black people off of streetcars, killing them on the street. It was a horrific event in 1917, and then the Red Summer begins in 1919. That's when you see massacres in Washington, D.C., Omaha, Nebraska, Chicago, Illinois. One of the worst is Elaine, Arkansas, which you'll see in this film. You'll see me traveling to Elaine and interviewing descendants of massacre victims. And then that leads, Red Summer sets the stage for Tulsa, the massacre in Tulsa. So it was a terrific, horrific reign of terror against Black people, and as many as 25 cities during this period of Red Summer saw violence, racial terror violence, white mobs attacking Black people during this period. So this, as you said, this film comes at a time when the country is going through another cycle of violence against Black people. The film comes at a time when protesters have poured into the streets, after the killing of George Floyd, demanding justice, demanding an end to police brutality. Protesters, anti-racism protesters marching through the streets of cities across the country and across the world. So I hope, this film helps prompt a conversation about that history and then connecting the dots to provide a context and an understanding for what's happening now.
Right. Perfectly put. And, that we, look, don't rest on your laurels. We've got a long way to go. We have to have some very tough conversations. And I think we have to grapple with reparations as on a real level, whatever that looks like. But again, the name of the documentary is called Rise Again, Tulsa and the Red Summer. It's going to be on National Geographic Channel, marking the 100th anniversary. Right. And then I'll have the dates and the links and everything put up there.
So it's coming out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rise Again, Red Summer is going to be released on June 18th on Nat Geo TV, and then June 19th on Hulu.
So
it's going to kind of come at the same time as the Juneteenth celebrations.
Yeah.
Juneteenth is celebrated in Black communities all over the world.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that they changed the release date, so it's going to be June 18th on National Geographic and on the same day on Hulu.
Oh, okay. That is new. Okay, thank you for that, Erica.
So
there you go. In time for, we can rephrase it. We'll just say it'll be available. It'll be streaming on Hulu for Hulu subscribers, starting the 18th as well, in time for Juneteenth, which is the next day.
Yeah, that's right.
How did you, by the way, and I want to respect your time. I know you probably have things going on, but how did you and Dawn end up collaborating, let's say?
So I worked on a magazine piece for National Geographic when Trump was coming to Tulsa. I basically pitched a piece saying, all the reporters all over the world, they're going to start with the arrest of Dick Rowland at the courthouse to talk about what sparked the massacre in Tulsa to set the stage for Trump's visit. So I was telling my editor, well, we should really explore Red Summer because Red Summer sets the stage for Tulsa. So I actually wrote a magazine piece in National Geographic about Red Summer setting the stage for Tulsa. And when National Geographic was considering working on creating a film about the Tulsa Race Massacre and its anniversary, they reached out to Dawn Porter as the director. She came on board, and originally I was going to be a consultant behind the scenes. And Dawn Porter decided to kind of follow me and follow my reporting.
Wisely. Wisely. All right. Well, I hope this was not a thoroughly dissatisfying experience doing this having a conversation. I enjoyed it.
Oh, this is a great conversation.
Oh,
You've asked really wonderful questions, and it's just been an honor to talk about the project and really try to explain for the viewers and the listeners, this piece of history that is so important. It's not just Black history, it's American history.
Exactly.
We all should know about it.
I mean, everything else is not worked out. Why, if ignoring, all right, let's just take it intellectually. If you ignoring history certainly hasn't gotten us anywhere, that's been proven. So let's just own it. Let's just talk about it and own it, and we'll all benefit from it. That's what all these, I think really, I'm going to say anxious and angry people, scared people don't, I mean, white people, but the ones that are having the real problem, I think it's just, they have to learn that it's nothing, but it'll benefit everybody. There's no threat here. Just,
absolutely. Yeah, coming to terms with this history that they tried to whitewash, but as I say, the truth will break through the ground. The truth will unleash itself. You can't cover it.
And we see that with the mass graves that are being discovered. Exactly. So anyway, thank you. And we'll encourage people to see the documentary.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And follow you on Twitter. I'm assuming you're on Twitter because you're a journalist.
I am on Twitter.
DeNeen Brown.
DeNeen L Brown.
Okay.
I tweet my stories, and I tweet. For example, I tweeted the front page of the Oklahoma Eagle last night, but I tweet as I go about my reporting.
Yeah, I guess it's now become a part of the job, as well as maybe you get some pleasure out of it, but it's right. You kind of have to do that, I suppose.
Yeah, you have to engage as much as possible.
DeNeen Brown, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Anytime. Hopefully.
It's a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, apologies for your making you sit around waiting for me. Thank you.
No problem. Have a great day.
You too.
It was great to see you. Bye-bye.